Welcome to Ecologic for the month of May. Beautiful time of the year. A little dry. I hope your gardens are doing well. We're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Malcolm Vidrine, who has spent a lifetime of working on the Cajun native prairies. It's kind of a forgotten habitat in coastal Louisiana, South Louisiana. It involves the prairies from Lafayette west all the way to the Sabine, probably goes into Texas. The Katy Prairie is probably part of the original system. But in Louisiana, there's not much of it left. The highest estimate is maybe 3,000 acres in sparse units, none of it very large, over those 9 or 10 parishes that have the native prairies. A lot of it's nearly all been converted to agriculture. Some of it has been converted to forestry. But this is a very rich habitat and rich in wildlife. The bison were here, antelope, black-tailed deer, white-tailed deer, whole list. The bison stomps, which Cypress Lake at UL campus was one of those bison stomps. It's where they wallowed in the mud and water. And they're all over coastal Louisiana, so in the prairie zone. So I know St. Martin Parish has several of them. That's a parish we probably forget. Right near Catahoula, there's several of the bison stomps, and there's right now what is cane field. So this is a habitat that's been forgotten, so to speak, in its richness in botanical diversity of wildlife. They had the lesser prairie chicken, which has some remnant populations in North Cameron and South Jeff Davis Parish, according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So we can look at the coastal habitat, the coastal marshes, and we have one wildlife reserve after another: Marsh Island State Reserve, Ottoman Reserve, Rockefeller, the Cameron Prairies, La Cassine, Sabine Reserve. We're talking about almost 500,000 or 600,000 acres preservation. The forestry preserves, the Coxsackie system, almost 1 million acres. But we don't have an acre set up as a preserve for the prairies that was so rich in wildlife and habitat. So the guy that's been, along with several other people, have been working real hard over the last few decades in tallying and documenting and studying and researching it and starting remnant prairies. Dr. Malcolm Vidrine has been leading in that. He's authored books in the subject, and he's also has set up the Eunice Prairie, which is 10 acres, a little prairie by his home with 3 acres, and another volunteer acreage of 65 there. So, Dr. Vidrine, share that rich history of Louisiana.
Well, good evening. I think I'll start with a little PowerPoint that I work with when I'm giving presentations to catch you up to date. It starts with a history. So can you load that up? Now he's working on it. So here we go. I call it Rewilding Acadiana because the way I look at things and I've come to appreciate is that when the Cajuns arrived back in the 1700s, the prairie, the extant prairie at that time, and its associated habitats provided what we call carbon in science, which ended up being what we mined literally above ground and below ground to produce our wealth. So we are a wealthy part of Louisiana, Acadiana per se. And that's because we were able to figure out how to use that carbon effectively, efficiently, and economically. All right, so let's do this quick rewilding of Acadiana. Next slide. This is just some of my creds. Next slide. So the story of a Cajun Prairie begins with, of course, Thomas Jefferson's buying the Louisiana Purchase, and he sent C.C. Robin to check out this southern part of the prairie. So C.C. Robin wrote a book, and then William Darby came back in 1816. Robin's book was in 1807. Darby's book was in 1816, and then Samuel Lockett wrote a book in 1850. So here's a book. I was surprised to find this in the LSU library, the copy of Darby's book. The next one, next slide. Here's the original maps drawn by Samuel Lockett. Samuel Lockett was a professor at LSU when LSU was up in Alexandria. So there's a rich history of all these parts of the state interplaying. Next slide. So here's what the prairie looks like today, as far as we can guess. The prairie now is a region that you can't say it exists anymore except the soil type. And that soil type underlies what we know as the farmland of southwestern Louisiana. So all these rice, soybean, crawfish fields, and cattle, livestock areas.
And now sugarcane.
And sugarcane overlie these prairie areas. You can almost divide this prairie in half. The eastern half they used to call the cotton and corn area, which had a deep topsoil. The western half, west of Church Point and west of Crawley, Rain area, had very shallow topsoil, just a foot or two, and that's where we grew rice and livestock. Unfortunately, across the area, there's a massive loss of topsoil, but that's another topic. Next slide. So back in the 1986, Dr. Charles Allen and I were working on a mosquito project in Acadia Parish, and we were driving around, and Dr. Allen told me to stop the vehicle, and he jumped out and he started collecting plants along a railroad right-of-way. When I got down and asked him, what are you doing? Because he was taking an inordinately long time. He said that he was collecting plants, and this was prairie. Now, my mother and father, because I grew up in Eunice, my mother and father knew that this had been prairie, and they would tell me that this was prairie, but I did not know what prairie was, even though I had a PhD in biology. So I was surprised. So I looked around, and because I worked for a mosquito control district in Jeff Davis, I told them, I've seen places like this in Jeff Davis. So we drove around southwestern Louisiana and rediscovered this Cajun prairie. And so this is the first article in a newspaper reporting our rediscovery. But there was much more to learn. Next slide. So what's in this Cajun prairie? It used to be called the Great Southwestern Louisiana Prairie. It's an ecosystem that interdigitates with the forest and the swamps, etc. Covered about 2.5 million acres. And literally, the best way to look at it is that it extends from the Chafalay Basin to the Sabine River. But if you're driving through it, it's literally from Lafayette to Lake Charles and north to Ville Platte. From what we've gathered, inventorying that area, there was nearly 1,000 species of plants and many more species of animals. Next slide. So this diverse fauna and flora, the plants and animals, turned out, as we continue to study them, to be unique to this region. And because of something now we call ecotypes, we now know genetically that plants and animals are intimately interlocked into cycles, ecological cycles, which makes the prairie now, with its plants and animals that remain, a unique system. So in essence, that system is in dire straits, and that's really why I'm here tonight. Next slide. So after we discovered the prairie and studied it for 5 years or so, Dr. Allen talked with the mayor of Eunice, Curtis Joubert, and we decided to install a prairie, recreate one in Eunice. Next slide. And so that meant bringing in plants, grasses, sunflowers, peas, mints, milkweeds, so that we would create this habitat by bringing in plants. It's called prairie restoration. Next slide. So here's some of the prairie plants we saw out in the remnant strips that we found along the railroad track. This is Texas brown-eyed Susan. Now you can go through the slides rather rapidly. These are blazing stars. is more blazing stars. These are with a plant known as compass plant. These are blazing stars and Indian plantain. So these are different remnant prairies. And you notice that the plants are in strategic locations. So the prairie was a mosaic of many of these different habitats or sub-habitats of prairie. Sorry, all of these remnants are literally decimated, as is much of this prairie, which is why I'm issuing a clarion call to tell you that we need to do something about this. That is, bring this prairie home and recreate it. So we wrote an article on wildflowers of the Cajun Prairie, which we published in Louisiana Conservationist. This article shows some basic ecology. It shows the different flowering plants in the prairie and the fact that they bloom in sequence, so that every 2 weeks to a month, if you go out to a prairie, you'll see a different floral scape. So let's see the next few slides. So you can see here's February to April, different flowers blooming. May to June, different flowers blooming. July to August, different flowers. So you can see each month is different flowers. But the thing is that the bees and the butterflies and the birds are all in tune with these different flowers. Different bees have host-specific responses, so they're looking for specific flowers. So this change, this kaleidoscope of change, provides for a change in the butterflies, the bees, the birds. It's all in sync, and that sync is broken now. And that's why this is so important. Next slide. This is Dr. Allen walking through this. It's called the tall grass prairie because in August, September, October, it got to be taller than a man. In fact, taller than a man on horseback. And of course, this prairie was tremendous grazing land, so there were lots of feral cattle released by Coronado, believe it or not, that the Native Americans or indigenous Americans raised for livestock. Next slide. So I've written several books about this. This is just several of the ones that are more recent. They're available on my website. Next slide. So we decided to do a prairie in Eunice. We needed to know if we could restore this prairie. Aldo Leopold up in Wisconsin had done some prairie restoration in the 30s, 40s, 50s, but we didn't know about Acadiana. So we took this project in Eunice, 10 acres, and we began restoration in 1988 with the help of the community. The kids went out and collected seeds from the different schools, and we planted this 10 acres in the winter of '88. Let's look at a series of slides pretty quickly here. So here's that 10-acre square. We now have a pavilion and a trail around it. Next slide. And of course, here's a series of slides from 2018, the 30th year of its development. So let's go through the slides pretty quickly. So it starts with burning it in the winter, and it looks like it's dead, but really it's just coming to life. That's February. March.
Which the Native Americans did quite a bit.
Right. It's a natural burn ecosystem from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Mississippi River. So this is March, April.
Oh, that's where I stopped at 31. That was the last slide I had. 31.
That's the last slide you have on that set?
Let me double check. Hang on. I'm going to cut you off one sec.
Okay. So anyway, we successfully restored this prairie in Eunice, and we monitor it, and now it is like Noah's Ark. It has the seed source. So we successfully protected and saved the original genetics from the Cajun prairie. And those seeds are now being used to start many other prairies.
Were you gathering these from some of the old railroad sites?
Right.
Rain and so forth?
To build this Eunice prairie, we brought the school children from almost every grade, and of course students from LSUE, and we went out and we collected the prairie several different times, remnants along the railroad rights-of-way, and we brought that seed in the units. Okay, he's looking at the different months now. This is like June. This would be almost coming right up. This is July, August, more August. August and September are just absolutely gorgeous because the blazing stars are blooming. Now we hit September, October's coming up. Tall grasses, but the tall grasses in Eunice are pretty much retained in a few places because it's mainly a meadowscape. So you can build this prairie into any number of different designs. And so here's October, November coming up, and we see the end of the growing season. So we know we can do it, and we've done it. We did it in our yards, my wife and I. So here's a quick look at our yards. Here's my 3-acre lot with Gail, my wife. We took the front 1.5 acres and built what we call the Cajun Prairie Gardens. And this 1.5 acres is restored now, and it's more of a wet prairie, but it's very florific, has lots of flowers, and not as many insects because we're in the middle of a bunch of rice fields and a lot of spraying goes on, but it's better than if we didn't have these wildflowers. So those are just, this is like late August here, September, and we're ready for winter. So here, we want to focus on this slide just for a moment to let you know that we've been showing you what's above ground. See the line in the center of this drawing with the lawn over on your left, that little short grass stuff, well, that's your lawn. It literally has no really distinct root system. But the Cajun prairie, like the prairie in the Midwest, and this is Heidi Natura's drawing of the Midwestern prairie, has this marvelous root system. The prairie is very diverse, hundreds of species of plants, each one with a different network of roots, and the roots actually entangle and work together with fungi and bacteria and lots of insects that live in the soil. And together they built this magnificent topsoil that the early Cajuns found here. And of course, when the Germans moved in and began growing rice, they discovered that this is absolutely fantastic. The early Cajun prairie apparently had about 8% carbon. And in the marshy areas, because it was a wet prairie, 12% carbon, which for farmers, they know that this means that soil was super rich. You could have grown almost anything in it. So anyway, so our goal is to get people to create prairies. The big deal, I think, at my first initiative was to build a garden in my own yard and show people that if you own a 2 or 3 acre lot, there's no reason you should be mowing 2 or 3 acres. You should put 1 acre in prairie. And as a result, not only will you provide what I consider a beautiful habitat, but you'll also be creating a place where birds and butterflies and things can reconnect with the ecosystem. Now the story of the prairie gets really complex thereafter, because what happens from here on is that you begin to realize the prairie is the source of our wealth, not only our economic wealth, but our wealth as humans. You see, the prairie was a hydrology system. When it rained, the water went down the roots into the subsoil, into what we call the shallow aquifer. And that shallow aquifer moved laterally to the bayous. And in those bayous, I can remember I grew up on Bayou Duquesne, there were springs that were a good 6-8 inches in diameter you could stick your arm into, and the cool water was bubbling up. I studied mussels for my dissertation, and what I came to realize is that all the streams in southern Louisiana once ran clear, and most of them were sand bottom.
Yes.
Now they had periods of muddy bottom and muddy silts when they had severe weather and things of that sort, but they usually ran clear. The evidence for that is a little more baffling than we can present here, but the evidence is strong. So what happened is the water would percolate through the soils and end up in the bayous, so the bayous were flowing clear water perennially.
Yes.
Whereas today, when it rains, the subsoil has been lost. The topsoil and much of the subsoil has been compacted. So the water's just running off into the bayou. So you're getting sedimentation in the bayou, which of course requires dredging to clean it out. And of course, then you get the water running off quickly and flooding areas downstream. So many of the problems that we see in our development are a product of how we handle the Cajun prairie. And so I'm gonna push the fact that if we can put prairie back in everyone's yard, or as many people's yards as possible, or in 100 acres here, 100 acres there, and fields, but the real goal is to get a reserve, because there is no reserve for prairie in Louisiana that represents an area where those wild beings can persist.
And, you know, I have to mention that this is something that is quite doable. We needed to restore and save the Louisiana black bear. We needed a reserve to do it. And ended up with one property owner in St. Mary Parish that had the ideal habitat that needed preserved. And from that one owner, U.S. Fish and Wildlife acquired 28,000 acres of land, and where black bear are thriving. It's the ideal combination of forest and ag land. And there's 28,000 acres, of which about 6,000 acres was sugarcane, which was supposed to be returned to forest. And that's a kind of a mitigation issue. And they're wondering if mitigation, we always think of going to the swampland and restoring the trees that agriculture took out. You know, when you destroy wetlands, you have to mitigate, you know, 3 for 1. If you take 100 acres of swampland or whatever to build a pipeline, you got to restore 3 acres for 1. And the issue is, should we be including not only restoration of swamps, but restoration of prairies as part of a mitigation opportunity? And if we can accomplish that, we can receive, you know, thousands of acres, and these programs are very well managed by the Corps. Success of tree planting it has to be annually checked, and you know, in 5 years you have to have 50% of the trees survive, and it's trees that are very beneficial to wildlife. It's a great program restoring the natural processes that are in forested wetlands or swamps, and so there may be that same opportunity with coastal prairies. It's habitat that's just as valuable, but it's kind of ignored because we looked at an open field as, well, a forest is a lot more interesting, and certainly the marsh, you know, full of ducks and geese and alligators and wildlife, they managed to preserve the dickens out of that. And they preserved it because they couldn't farm it, although they tried to farm it. You know, all over coastal Louisiana, they built canals around the marsh, pumped it out, and tried to grow crops. Around New Orleans, they did it, the La Branche Whitelands.
In the
They
last,
did it in Delta Farms along Bayou Forge. Thousands and thousands of acres of marshland were drained to grow sugarcane. You could still see the rows there. It was not successful, but that's why, you know, they could set aside I think the coastal lands, because the only thing they were worth fooling with was either the fur. It was valuable for the ducks and geese because there were people from all over the country came and took advantage of that. But the coastal prairies were pretty much ignored, and they shouldn't be.
in the last 7 years, they've started doing some wetland mitigation properties where they're putting prairie in.
Great. You on air? Can we help you?
Yeah, hey Harold. You know me, I'm Bob Hammock, but I just wanted to tell you that I live in Bendel Gardens, and there was some people that lived here for probably about 3 or 4 years, and they moved out about a year ago. But in the middle of the subdivision, they had planted what looked like just a weed patch, you know, but it wasn't. It was what you're talking about. It was just in a front yard, and it was really nice, and people really liked it.
How'd the city let them get away with that?
Well, I don't know. Nobody bothered them, but on our little neighborhood Facebook page, we had people saying, man, that's really cool what you're doing, So I guess most people, if you're a conventional suburbanite, modern 21st century person or 20th century, whatever, all you want to have is a beautiful green yard with no weeds or anything like that. And of course, I think what a lot of people don't realize is that's not a good thing, So anyway, I just wanted to make that little observation, and
Thanks.
I mean,
Well, thank you for sharing, thank you for
don't
sharing
just
that,
work
Bob.
because it'd be a good thing. Okay.
Yeah,
bye.
thank you for sharing that, yes, sir.
All right, bye.
The, on our place, we have set up maybe a quarter acre of native prairies, brought into plants, and it's kind of a weed patch. But a weed is just a plant that qualities have not yet been found. But it's beautiful, flowers that come up, and they're constantly changing as the year goes on.
We're looking at a half a dozen, at least, different functions that you can use a prairie for, right? Because we don't want you to think that a prairie, you just put it in, you forget about it. It's a garden per se, but really it's a functioning unit. So you can put in a prairie that may serve as a pollinator garden. Or you can do as my neighbors have, Vernon and Justin Fuselier, put in a 65-acre prairie, which serves for mob grazing their cattle. So they've developed a management plan, where they use their prairies, which are beautiful Cajun prairies.
And they allow cattle
To
grazing.
graze cattle. They just move them every day, an acre or two, and they also have another couple of hundred acres of typical pasture, so they only put them on the prairie for a few weeks a year. But that is part of the cycle.
Certainly, honey production certainly could be a part of it,
And prairies can be used for wetland mitigation. They can certainly be used in any kind of hunting preserve. There's, like I say, at least a half dozen ways you can look at it. You can also, just in the long run, if you're thinking in terms of ecosystems geologically, if you have a piece of farmland that has been degraded, you know that farmland is not producing. You can start putting in prairie, give it time, and in Vernon's prairie, Vernon Fuselier's prairie, we've moved from 0.5% carbon to 5% carbon in a matter of 15 years.
Wow.
Now, the prairie is really, you have to think about it now. The prairie doesn't become an instant thing. So you throw seed out, or you can plug it to make it a little faster, but that's more expensive. But you can throw seed out and you have to wait. I always tell people, first year sleep, second year creep, third year leap. But it'll be about 5 years before it starts to look prairie and behave like a prairie. But in the 6th, 7th, 8th year, those prairie plants are pulling that carbon out of the air, fixing it into what are called photosynthates, and feeding it to the microbes, bacteria, etc. We used to think that most of the carbon was held in the roots of the plants, but now we know that it's really the fungi and the bacteria that are holding the carbon in the soil.
Wow.
And there's this intimate relationship between plant roots, fungi, we call them mycorrhizae, and bacteria, where they're communicating chemically, and in that process, they're literally taking the carbon out of the air and sequestering it in the soil. How deep, you say? Well, we went to Vernon's farm in his 15-year-old restoration, and we dug there with a backhoe, and at 6 feet, we still had roots the size of pencil lead. So we
Wow.
know his plants are sending roots down at least 6 feet, probably 8 or so. And what's happening is we're seeing the soil change back to what was seen by the early settlers, a soil with high carbon content. So if you think in the long term, you can build a prairie, and it's like an investment. And a decade, maybe 2, maybe 3 from now, that soil will be rejuvenated, and you begin farming it. So what you do is you put your land into a cycle. This is a long-term plan. You don't think about short-term with prairies. That's the wrong way of thinking about it. You have to have a generational plan. And so this is why this is so attractive to landowners. They own the land, and they want to have a generational plan. That means put in prairie and allow it to grow and appreciate what it's doing intimately at each step of its development, but know that in the end, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, you'll have recreated an ecosystem that will have recreated the carbon storage in your soil.
And the larger the site, the greater opportunity for wildlife and birds and so forth, and to be a part of that solution. You're there, can we help you?
Yes, Dr. Vadrine, I wanted to ask about the plants or the system you have in your yard. You're obviously not able to burn that every year. How does that work? How do you, what do you do instead of burning, or just let it go, or how does that work?
Well, we burn it every year, and we get some of the neighbors to help. And we burn it. We have to wait for the wind to be just right. We live outside of Eunice. We live in a rural area. We have a commercial lot, and our yard is operated as a commercial farm where we grow seed to sell. So we burn it. We burn it usually when it's not the best day of the year to burn. So we only get about a 60 to 70% burn. So it doesn't end up like a clean slate like in Eunice. We also used to burn Eunice every year, but we changed our regimen in Eunice and burned that like every other year. But we'll probably reconsider that management program. Things are changing in Eunice. Eunice, they've just built a giant building on the west side of our prairie, and I think it's interfered with the hydrology. It's messed up the shallow aquifer, so the Eunice prairie soils are looking more hydrated. So I think it's going to change the flora. The plants at the Eunice prairie are going to be different. My front yard was an old rice field. It was a lawn for about 10 years, but before that it was a rice field. But when we built our house, we blocked the drainage, so much of my front yard operates as a basin. So it's a wet prairie. One would describe it as a mare, which is what we traditionally called wet prairies. The original rice fields in South Louisiana were in mares. I don't know if I've answered your question, but we do burn my front yard. It's not always the prettiest burn. But back in the old days, we could burn it hotter. But as more people move in our area, it's a rural lot. It's a commercial lot and a 3-acre lot. They're doing this with rice farms when they begin to fail. They cut them into 3-acre lots along the major thoroughfares, along the major roads, and they sell the lots. You've probably seen this driving in the country. And those 3-acre lots, usually a house is on 1 acre and the other 2 acres they mow. So that literally thousands and maybe tens of thousands of acres are simply being mowed as these giant front yards. And this is where I say that we can all make a contribution, put in an acre, and then all these acres start to add up. In ecology, there's something known as island biogeography, where we've studied what happens to biota, living things, on on islands actually in the ocean. And we found that small islands have few species. The larger the island, it's very logical, isn't it? The larger the island, the more species that you have. But if you have two small islands that are close to one another, proximity, then each of them will have more species. 3 small islands close to one another, and as a group they will begin to function as a unit. So as we recognize that this is the way that we can work as a team, because Acadiana has to work like a community in order to do this, because as a community they've benefited beyond measure off this prairie and off the wetlands surrounding it. And the prairie and the wetlands are working together. It's no more obvious than thinking about hypoxic zones now, because the fertilizer that's running off of these rice fields and bean fields and sugarcane fields is flowing into our rivers and makes it to the marsh and causes fish kills and makes it out into the Gulf, and it contributes to the huge hypoxic zone known as the Gulf Dead Zone. So we're all connected, we're all working together.
And that dead zone is worse south of the Cajun Prairies.
And the latest bloom in the 2021 map shows the biggest explosion off the Mermentau. So anyway, the idea is as we begin to put habitat, which is your lawn, your field, back into prairie, we begin to reconstruct the hydrology, bring back the habitat for wildlife, and invest in a future where there'll be carbon in the soil, so you don't have to fertilize, right? Every acre you take out of production is an acre you're no longer fertilizing. It's an acre you're no longer spraying all kinds of biocides on, like Roundup.
Yeah.
And so you start thinking, well, how can I reduce it? Well, the more acres you put into that prairie, the less biocides you're using, the less fertilizer, and the more the plants themselves are doing the work for you and putting the carbon in the ground.
So if you restored, say, 8 or 10,000, 20,000 acres, that restoration would become an opportunity to educate our children on what the history of that area was. You could bring the bison and the elk and so forth that were originally here. You would have an enormous tourist attraction, besides benefiting all the different species of birds in that larger site. And that's what we did with Rockefeller Reserve. It's 90,000 acres. I think Lacassine is 35,000 acres. The people had the wisdom to set these sites aside. We just missed the boat on the prairies. But
Well,
we made able to catch up.
I want to make one big point about prairie, and this is held out. Prairie restoration, which I call rewilding, because I want to connect the prairie to the river, to the forest, because they operate as a unit. But the prairie portion of this is the cheapest and the easiest one to do. You can buy seed relatively cheap compared to buying trees, etc.
Yeah.
And you can
Much
seed that
easier to
prairie.
plant.
And it's much cheaper. It's faster. You say, well, if a prairie takes 5 years, that's a long time. Do you have any idea how long it takes a forest to develop? Or a river to clear itself?
Yeah.
And I think we have to start upstream. Upstream means the prairie here. So if you need to restore the prairie first, because that's upstream, and then you start working your way downstream. We're going to get $50 billion in a master plan to try to work the marsh and preserve it, when we should be thinking about how to restore the prairie and work top down.
Yeah.
I'm not saying don't spend the $50 billion, but hey, if 10% of that money went to restoring prairie, I think you'd see a functional difference in the marsh, far beyond what you'll get out of putting $5 billion in the marsh.
We're spending $1 billion a year. Right in Vermilion Parish, there's one project that was 305 acres of marsh loss, marsh turned to open lake. We spent $38 million on that. And 2 years later, it's all back, it's all gone. You think we got to rethink of how we're spending this conservation money. And the conservation money certainly should be tied to restoration of prairies, which tie right into the marsh and into the Gulf and the whole ecosystem.
If you want to know how ambitious some people are, up in Montana, they're trying to create what they call the American Serengeti Project. Their goal is 3.2 million acres. They now have like 250,000, maybe 300,000 acres, and that acreage is adjacent to some federal property. So if you Google or go online on YouTube and type in American Serengeti, you can see what's happening in Montana. They're creating this huge prairie. And people want to come see it. They want to see that vast land. And there, of course, they're thinking about bringing back the large herbivores and talking about even some carnivores. I'm not there yet. I'm still trying to figure out how to reestablish a plant community for the butterflies and the birds. So I'm at the very onset of this. I'm thinking butterflies, birds. I extend my thoughts to mussels in the river, because if the rivers remain muddy, you lose your freshwater mussel beds. And because the freshwater mussel beds are where the fish like to hang out, guess what? You lose the fish too.
And the mussels play a big role in clarifying water.
Right. They're what I call a knock-on impact. If you can get the hydrology working, the rivers start to clear up. If you have mussel beds, and the rivers in South Louisiana were all, based as I can tell, pre-colonial times, cobbled with mussels.
Yeah.
So that if you went out into the river, There'd just be mussels upon mussels upon mussels. In fact, they looked for the heaviest beds across bayous to figure out where to pass their wagons. So the wagons became, wagon trails were the foundation, was the mussel beds.
We're looking for the shell banks, yes.
So yeah, and so
Okay.
anyway, the same thing happened in Tennessee. They built those dams, the Tennessee dams, right on top of the mussel beds, because that's where it was most, the bottom rock or rock bottom was most stable.
The, yeah, and the loss of mussels is certainly tied to, very water that is filled with sediment washing off of fields that have no plant life on them at all. And then the damming of rivers everywhere, because the mussels need flowing water. So if you dam it, you lose all the mussels in the lake. And of course, we've built these dams all over the country. It's phenomenal. The Missouri is about 50 miles longer than the Mississippi, and the total dams on the Missouri distribution system is 17,200. And so the sediment, the water flow that nourishes us all the way to the Gulf is being blocked and stopped. And it's been very beneficial in a lot of ways. You could irrigate the desert with the dam waters that are being provided.
Now, I worked for mosquito control for 4 years, and we developed all kinds of models. I was in integrated pest management. And the bottom line, working with mosquito control, was to find out that we were spraying chemicals and, for the most part, killing pollinators rather than mosquitoes. It turns out that the whole concept of mosquito control, as we practice it, is actually causing a biodiversity crisis in insects.
Yes, sir. Can we help you?
Yeah, Harold, this is Brent Logan. Look, I was just wondering, like wetlands and all, did the county agents or anything have anything to help you to set up a prairie or whatever, or do you just, you got to do that all on your own?
So I'm not into that per se, but I advise people. I think the landowners have to do this. If you wait on the government, what I tell people is if you wait on the government to take care of this, they're going to arrive too late, and probably with the wrong kind of help. So my push right now, until we have a program developed, I'm pushing for a subsidy. I want to see the federal government subsidize farmers for putting in prairies.
My father bought a ranch out in Texas. He went to the county agent. He had some kind of Texas bluegrass, and they said, hey, we'll help you out if you put some water in and work on that. And he was able to get some kind of subsidy.
Oh, well, there are programs like CGRIP. There are conservation programs with the USDA. I don't work with those, but if you contact the U.S. Department of Agriculture, NRCS, National Resources Conservation, there are several programs, WHIP programs, CGRIP programs, all of that government speak. I know about them existing, and I know that prairies are put in. Yeah, but the amount of money you're getting, in my mind, is not sufficient for what you're doing. When you're putting in prairie, you're making a significant contribution to every one of your neighbors. It's already been shown that if you put in an acre of prairie, with the birds that move in, it's kind of like a crawfish pond, right? When the birds that move in and start eating the crawfish, eating the insects in the prairie, eating the seeds, as they fly around to adjacent fields, they're actually fertilizing all those fields. So work that's been done, a lot of it in England, shows that these rewilding efforts actually help all the neighbors benefit from any kind of rewilding
How do
effort.
your neighbors react to a prairie next to their home?
My neighbors,
They want grass, or are they okay?
my neighbors used to call me names, and now they stop by and pick up seed. Vernon was my neighbor, for example, and he drove by for a couple of years, and then he stopped and talked to me, and next thing I know, he's there every Sunday afternoon harvesting seed in my yard to plant his prairies. And now he has 60, I had an acre and a half, he's got 65 acres.
Wow.
So you see what happens. If you put in the prairie, you lose some people. Some people will not understand. They'll want to argue about it, every aspect. But there are those people, and it's becoming, I think, more and more people are getting this wavelength. They see the insects disappearing. No more butterflies. The monarch butterfly brought that up front, right?
Yeah,
And they see the birds disappearing. Now, we have a lot of wading birds. That's because we put in a lot of crawfish fields, right? The reason we have so many birds like at Lake Martin, according to Jay Huner, is because we put in all these crawfish patties.
yeah.
Uh,
Which
so-
was food for the juveniles.
And a crawfish pad is a lot more natural than a rice field, believe it or not. But at the same time, I'm not suggesting we put in a whole bunch more crawfish patties, because I'm thinking that there's, at this point, we're probably producing more crawfish than we could sell. Anyway, it's a very complex question. I don't have a simple answer. NRCS does do some CGRIP, WIP programs, and you would contact your county agent and see what you can get involved, or contact the feds at NRCS.
Thank you for the call,
But
Frank.
if you buy property and you got to mow, that's a lot harder problem than, probably maintaining a prairie.
That's a great point.
Yeah, that's right, what it costs to mow.
But mowing is such a pleasant thing. You
Oh,
can
yeah.
look behind you and it's just absolutely, it looks like a golf course.
Right.
So I don't want to deny anybody a chance to mow. In fact, I say put in a prairie and mow a trail right through it like I do, and it really feels significant.
Right, yeah. So, thank you, Brett, thank you.
Thank you so much.
So, I mean, you think the guys who raise bees and honey would likely want to locate right next to the acreage, right?
I would think so, but I'm not encouraging honeybees. I'm more for native bees.
You're on the air, please?
Hey, Harold, Dr. Vidrine, how are y'all today? Hello?
Yes, sir, we got you, Darrell.
All right.
Are you still in Pecan Island?
Yeah, we sure are.
Well, we're glad you reaching out there, that's great.
Yeah, we're out here. We kind of enjoy some things that we can still enjoy. Dr. Vidrine's ideas about the prairie lands, of course, that's great ideas, and certainly would be great if that could be put back together.
The guy I'm talking, Darrell grew up in Allen Parish, so he's
Oh,
part
okay.
of the prairies.
Yeah, I grew up right on the edge of it there between Oakdale and Oakland back in.
Oh, so you know the Calcasieu
We were
River.
right on the edge of the piney woods going into the prairie land there.
So the Calcasieu River's got to be in your backyard. That's a marvelous
I-
river.
I
It is.
stayed on the Calcasieu River all the time. There was about half to 3/4 mile behind my house. We was back and forth there all the time.
It has a wonderful
So,
mussel population in it. It's a very
Yeah,
good, very
yeah.
healthy river for much of its length.
Yeah, they've left it natural
Well,
and they failed to dam it.
Yeah, they they put in a little dam there right there in Oakdale.
Yeah, it's
They
a little
kinda
weird,
controlled
yeah,
some of
in
the
Oakdale.
water level, but the biggest issue, they finally kind of got it cleaned up there at one point in time. Paper mills and all that dump water into dump stuff into the river, and there were times that it got damaged, but they got that under control pretty quickly. When I was a small kid, we'd go swimming and fishing in that river and really clear, all spring fed, and so it's a beautiful place to grow up for sure.
And that's a case where
right
the
now,
fort,
it's pretty much timber's been cut off of it and replanted now, so it's hard to recognize anymore.
but that's a case where the
But-
fort upstream, used to be Fort Polk, right? That fort upstream where they have an environmental management program, so they did quite a bit of work, and I did some work with them and sometimes to actually protect the streams that are the headwaters. And remember, everything works from the top down. I mean, it's not from the bottom up. In the case when you're thinking about hillsides and streams, you got to keep the stream healthy upstream in order for it to become and stay healthy as you move downstream. The same
That's
thing for
correct.
prairie. You
That's
got to do the prairie and then think about where the prairie is heading downstream.
Yeah, and it fed on down, and then you got the Whiskey Chit over there that feeds into all that prairie land down below there around Kinder and all that part of it in that area too. But the thing about it is, and I just feel bad about it, because all that's turned into farmland now, and it's be hard to ever be able to put together a large enough tract of land to significantly turn back the prairie. So.
If there are subsidies involved, here's the problem. If you can, and I don't want to depend on the government, but let's look at what the government's doing. Right now, the government has decided that solar panels are the way to go. So they're going to put in, from what I understand, 5,000 acres of solar panels in Jeff Davis Parish,
Wow,
and probably thousands of acres in other parishes.
yes.
So if you can get farmland to put solar panels up by subsidizing them, then I would think you can get farmers to start putting prairie in, and if there's some subsidizing.
Well,
If they can't
we've
get
done that.
subsidies from
We've
the
done that
government, if
with
their neighbors can
CRP.
support them and help them out, that's a big deal.
That's the CRP
Yeah.
program.
Yeah, I mean, we've done it with CRP, but you know, you got to take farmland out of farmland and turn it into grassland, free land, and of course these solar panels are not very conducive to having a prairie land because they're going to cover everything up.
Yeah, well, I talked to some people this week, and we talked about putting prairie on the border, and they were talking about a field that's going to be 400 acres, and I asked them, how much border are you talking about, and they hit the calculator and said about 60 acres. Now, I'll take 60 acres of prairie,
Yeah, that's significant.
60 out of 40, out of 400, that looks like a good number to get started.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Because this prairie persists. We have a little strip right there on the LSUE campus that's 30 feet wide. So you can put in prairie 30 feet wide and start building that system as a linear system.
And somebody's gonna gripe that they're not mowing the grass.
Well, of course, well, people will talk no matter what until there is no more opportunity.
Right, yeah.
Well, you know, Harold, you get one about 60 foot wide along the edge of a solar panel farm, make a good rabbit patch.
That's right, and then you think the runoff from the solar farm is gonna be helped with and retained by the native prairie. Before it gets into the stream. But look, there's some big projects, one in St. Landry Parish near Port Barry's, 2,500 acres.
Don't underestimate us, though. Once we start thinking about, they said the solar panels are going to be 18 inches off the ground. Once we start thinking about prairie plants, there are many plants that are 6 to 12 inches tall. And there may be a way to do that, but at this point, I can't hand them a piece of paper and tell them, this is what you need under the panels.
That's what we're looking for.
If it works around the solar farm, then that will be conducive to people thinking about, let's put it into the solar farm. This is one step at a time, but I'm willing to take my steps pretty quick. But one step at a time is the way I want to go. Let's start putting some prairie back in.
But Darryl, you can look at history. In '92, we listed the Louisiana black bear as endangered. So about 10 years have passed since after we listed that the biggest issue is habitat loss. So lo and behold, they found one landowner with 28,000 acres. Of that, 22,000 was occupied, critical habitat for the bear. And they negotiated a deal and bought that property. And so, you know, 100% of what we don't ask for, we won't get. So like saving the black bear, that habitat area probably is occupied right now by 500 or 600 bear. And so this wish list, there's somebody out there may be a willing participant and partner in saving the Cajun prairies like we saved the black bear.
Well, Doc, good luck with all that. I mean, it's a good project, and good luck with it.
Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for the call and the input.
Take care of yourselves,
Yes,
guys.
Yes.
Bye.
He grew up in Allen Parish, so he was right on the Calcasieu, which is amazing. That stream is pretty. That water's kept pretty clear, and it, you know, some of the areas.
This is a learning process. So you begin,
So
I've been doing this for 40 years. So you start off with a small piece of property and you
Let's see if we can
slowly
catch that
build.
one phone. You on
and
the
you're
phone? Can we help
constantly
you?
learning.
Yes, I want to know, we've heard how we can get in and get going on farmers, but I want to know if we can do it one garden at a time in towns and out in the parishes. There's no reason why we can't let our roadsides go wild and blow in the breeze with wildflowers and prairie flowers and give me some suggestions. I'm ready to go. This is Sarah Shepard.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, well, you have a little plot that you don't let me mow, so that's been very successful. But I think we have those opportunities all over. That brings us to the end of the program, so thank you so much, Dr. Bedreen, for being here, sharing your knowledge, and sharing your vision of rewilding, the prairies. I think there's so much at stake in restoring wildlife and bring some bison back. Let's get us a 20,000 acre reserve. Let's bring the elk, the bison, and all those critters back that our children need to see that this was what it was. That history, the evidence. There's no reason if we brought a big project back, we couldn't bring restoration of not only plant life, but the soil, restoration of the soils, the waters around it, and the wildlife that occupied it originally.
Let's think of it as an investment, not a sacrifice.
That's right, exactly. It is an investment in the future. I think